We began today's lecture with the definition of arbitrary freedom and citizenship freedom. What I like to show is what is the difference between the two. When we look at arbitrary freedom, we mean by the right to do certain actions within a certain time, however you feel like you're doing them. You have more control of your time and your actions. Um, a tribe is less focused on hierarchical systems and roles. It's as long as you follow within the tribe's roles of your life, you don't necessarily have institutions governing your life and your individual actions. So the same thing goes with the Germanic tribes that live outside of the Roman Empire. Their life is a lot more simpler, and they cover much out here outside of the top of the German Empire. The Roman Empire, as a opposite, has a more structured society, and as you can see, it's a very nice, wonderful place. But the majority of the people are slaves. Many of these provinces around here are non-citizens, and a lot of taxes have to be paid to eventually end up going to the central authority of the Roman Empire to Rome themselves, and eventually to their elite and their senators. So yes, they secure markets, and yes, they secure safety of the economy, but at a price, and the price is that the elite get to enjoy the fruits of the labor of the Roman Empire. So you can say that living out here, the outside of the Roman Empire, the Germanic tribes live a more simpler life, more rugged life, but a lot more free in terms of time and action of what they do. If we look at citizen rights, the individual may have rights as a citizen. They may have rights that protect them from abuse of the government, keeping them from becoming enslaved, or have laws that take away their property. But once an individual enters an institution, whether it be education, government, or job, they don't their time and their actions are now taken away and governed for the institution itself. In the case of the government can actually end your life if you're not following a certain law or a certain command. Economies can decide who lives and who dies and how well people's wealth will be. And institutions can also help decide who moves up and who has more power. So Native Americans and Germanic people avoid this type of structure because of the loss of freedom, whereas others may like the idea of having more structure within this the use of these institutions, maybe the institution of empire or of government and so forth. So as you can see, the two are different, but in our language, we tend to use these. We use a word freedom too broadly, and sometimes we confuse: are we talking about arbitrary freedom, or are we talking about citizens' freedom, where we have rights that are protected? We find in history there are many critiques of this concept of an empire or a government body. And one of the critiques is Christianity, or Judo Christianity, because its roots are in Judaism. And the critique is that governments are really human power, where human beings have the right to decide for themselves what is good and evil in terms of laws and morality, and who gets to live and who gets to die, and who gets to have the better life and who doesn't. According to Judaism, and because of Christianity comes from Judaism, this decision of human beings to decide for themselves the structure of their life and their and ethics brings in the concept of sin and death. And so, no matter how many empires come and go, these empires are always doing the same thing. They're always using human power to enslave others and so forth. The answer for Christianity is atonement, and the idea that God Himself comes into the world and rids the world of sin and death with the death and resurrection of the body incorporated by God, and in that resurrection. With the resurrection comes the church, or the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, which now individuals who are saved can now participate in this new world in which sin and death has been conquered. Um, we're going to come back to this concept when we talk about the Protestant Reformation, but I'm just letting you know that this was a critique of, or a different worldview other than the Roman Empire and this establishment of government. So right before the Renaissance, I'd like to remind you that the economy established in the Crusades had been the reestablishment of the Silk Road, in which many of the Renaissance cities like Florence and Venice had become very wealthy to start the Renaissance within these cities. But there is a warning of banking. And after several wars, and that include the Pope himself and other empire, the Roman Empire, the church had become very concerned about capitalism, and it wanted to put the brakes on the move of capitalism and wanted to hold on to a more agricultural farming society. This concept is going to come up again after the American Revolution, but we could already see that there is some problems with the idea of capitalism showing up and causing strife among different factions. So the answer for the church, like I mentioned before, is to hold on to an agricultural society. But with that said, the church is going to continue to draw money from all around uh, its you could say its church empire, which is mostly the remnants of the Roman Empire, all the Christian societies, and it's gonna create a more elaborate, more wealthier city in Rome. And you also have the popes and many of the clergy uh, participate more in worldly desires, political power, money, influence, and it's going to draw some of critiques, especially as the church becomes a little bit more aware of the Gospels in their universities. So one of the critiques of the excess of the Pope and the church comes from Martin Luther here in Germany. Martin Luther is nailing his 95 Thesis, what at the time was more of a critique of the church's excess and use or participation in worldly affairs, that being the economy and political affairs of the kings and so forth. He felt that the church had moved away from its uh, original Christian critique of empire and salvation. But one of the problems that Luther felt himself was he didn't feel grace or holiness, no matter how much he prayed or no matter how much he participated in the church's sacraments. Then he realized that in one of his sermons that grace and salvation comes with faith alone. So this is one of the influences of United States and also of Great Britain when we get to that influence later on. But this is also a revolutionary act. The 95 Thesis and his changing the theology of individuals not needing the church, just using their own Bible and having their own faith. This is a huge act of revolution, and according to Eric Foner, has echoes into the American Revolution and echoes even to today. One of the problems that we get with this is, or one of the contradictions, is that Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, meaning that he was part of the magisterium. So from his perspective, he's a well-read person who understands history. It's very easy for him to say, well, he has the ability to read on his own and understand the Gospels and connect to the ancient past. Whereas individuals may not have that same education or have that same perspective. So he is banking on the faith that individuals can pick up the Bible on their own with a new printing press and achieve this understanding of the gospel message without the magisterium. That's his faith. One of the things that he's influenced by doing this, by saying that the individual has that ability to achieve this, is that he sparks many revolutions and peasant wars among the northern tribes here. I mean, the northern peasants here in Germany, where we end up having what we call a peasant revolt, and they're asking Martin Luther to endorse this revolution. So his revolution, or his act of defying the Pope, also has implications of defining the hierarchy or the social norms of the medieval world at the time also. So here's a little interesting map. This is the old Roman Empire, where Rome is the central authority, and we have the German barbarians who are used to being far and free. If we look at the Protestant Reformation map after Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Thesis, and you have the Protestant churches, we'll talk about England a little bit, you'll see that there's a similarity between the Northerners here who are not part of the Roman Empire and the Northerners who joined the Protestant Reformation. And what historians have talked about in the thesis is that this has more to do with what we call cultural DNA. It seems to be that the further away people were away from Rome, the easier it was for them to become Protestant, and they already had within their culture a sense of individualism and anti-central authority, and that is why the two tend to have some kind of um, basic boundary and so forth. But this is one of the theories that have been used by historians to explain the Protestant Reformation.